Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 3. First thing you need to complete for the day is obviously your journal. I want to talk about thinking of a modern convenience that you rely on. So, obviously, the first one and quickest that comes to your mind is probably your cell phone. But think about little things, refrigerators, toilets, things of that nature. What benefits do these items bring you? Are there any drawbacks, etc.? Should be writing 4 to 5 sentences for each of your journals. If you have any questions about your journal, please make sure you're asking. So we're going to start Day 3, and we're going to start talking about expansion of American industry. And one of the first things that we forget about life in the 1800s especially, and life before that, is there's no electricity. And for each American and each person in what we would call modernized civilization, electricity is just a standard that we are used to living with. There's also many summers with no ice. They were forced to bring in huge blocks of ice that were covered in sawdust in order to try to have some ice during the summer. Mail was very slow. It took days to reach coast to coast to try to get information from place to place. And there's no quick way to travel. It's not like we have cars or airplanes or things of that nature. So things are just really slow and very, I don't want to call it backwards, but just unadvanced in comparison to what society is now. But all that's getting ready to change over the course of the next 30 years. Between 1860 and 1890, somewhere around about 500,000 patents were issued. And if you don't know what a patent is, that is essentially a document that you submit to the government that says that you have a new invention that you would like to have control over. That basically if anyone tries to make your idea, they can't, or they have to have your approval and have to give you some type of money or just pure approval in order to use your design. Things such as the typewriter and phonograph are going to be some of the initial inventions. There had only been 36,000 patents between 1790 to 1860. So in 30 years, 5 times that amount of patents were issued in 30-year period versus 70-year period. Some of the new inventions that were invented during this time period include electricity. We are also going to see a gas-powered machinery, and you're also going to see the first internal combustion engine, which is developed in Europe. Now, I know that's not American history, but it's important because when Nicholas Otto invents this engine, he basically takes a step towards us having automobiles because he realized that you could have an engine that was powering some sort of machine as long as it had gasoline. Now, what he didn't figure out was how to disconnect it from the hose and the gasoline source and have basically a tank inside of it. He never got to that point, but that type of machinery and the development of it is coming. Thomas Edison was a huge player in all of these inventions and really pushing us forward during this time period. He helped make electricity much more usable in regular everyday homes. He actually experimented with lighting individual homes at low cost, even built power plants in New York and various places and tried to develop what we kind of now know as the modern electrical standard. One of the men in his lab named Lewis Lattimore also was able to develop a filament for light bulbs that would make them last longer, essentially giving us something that the electricity could power and light a home. So no more lanterns, no more using crude oil, any of those types of things, kerosene, nothing like that you're going to have to use to light your home. Now, that's going to cause a lot of problems because the oil industry, as you're going to continue to learn, is really growing during this time. Rockefeller's pushing it, Vanderbilt's pushing it, and you're going to see the oil industry kind of take a dip when electricity finally comes of age because what do you need oil for? But what they're going to eventually figure out, obviously, is that you can use the runoff from making kerosene to make gasoline, which in turn can be used in engines. But they didn't really know that yet. They're still kind of learning about how to use gasoline. Now, Edison develops this idea of a central power station, and he believed that if you put one of these power stations in the middle of a city, it would power an entire city and would just continue to power itself over and over again. By 1890, electricity is powering lamps, fans, printing presses, actual appliances that are now being put in homes. So it allowed just kind of a step forward in social living and just kind of everyday life. Now, George Westinghouse was a competitor to Edison. When Edison first comes into the electric business, he's using what they call direct current. And it was very expensive, and it could only travel a mile or two in regards to before it started losing its strength, and then you would have to have another station or something else around to kind of pick back up that current and pull it along. Alternating current was actually much cheaper and could travel much longer distances. AC is what we still use today. Very few times will you ever run into a direct current situation. And honestly, I think direct current is only used in like machines that create electricity, that are manual machines. Not like there's nowhere, as far as I know, in the United States where direct current is still being used out of a power station. Everything has turned to AC. But at this time, this was a huge thing, because Edison and Westinghouse are going to get in a huge competition with trying to push DC versus AC. And one thing that we normally see in Men Who Build America that I would normally show you is Edison actually sets up an experiment to kind of go against alternating current. Nikola Tesla was one of his kind of cronies or one of his employees at his lab. And Tesla had developed alternating current, but Edison didn't believe it was effective. And so Tesla goes to Westinghouse and they join forces with this idea of alternating current and push it forward. Well, Edison gets this bright idea that he's going to take and have a electric chair that is going to kill a criminal. Basically, this is the development of the electric chair, and that they're going to show how dangerous alternating current is. The problem is when they get to this and they actually are putting the man in the electric chair, they didn't have a wet sponge, which we now know, if you've ever known anything about the electric chair, the sponge that they put on top of people's heads when they used to put them in the electric chair would actually conduct the electricity. Well, that didn't happen. And basically the man burned alive, and all people remembered was Edison and his crazy electric invention, not how bad alternating current was. So, pushing that forward, by 1898, 3,000 power stations are built, and GE and Westinghouse are going to grow exponentially. And GE was a company that came off of Edison Electric, which was purchased by J.P. Morgan, and then eventually changed over to AC and became General Electric. Now, you're also going to see the expansion of the railroads, and I'm going to try to move through this quicker. The Transcontinental Railroad is expanding during this time, and it was built by immigrants. Hard, backbreaking work, built by hand by Irish and Chinese workers especially. Irish workers on the eastern part of the railroad, Chinese workers coming in from the west and working. Finally, the Golden Spike is driven at Promontory Point in Utah, which joined the two railroads east and west. It was a huge moment in our nation's history to be able to join east and west, especially with travel and mail, etc. The problem is that they still haven't worked out those safety issues that we talked about in American History 1. Safety issues such as no signals, bad brakes, things of that nature. Fortunately, George Westinghouse is going to come up with another great invention called air brakes. And air brakes are still something that we use today. And basically just going to allow the trains to be able to slow down, which is going to speed up travel, because now they can get there, slow down, speed back up, slow down. It's also going to lower the price of shipping various items. So a barrel of flour, for example, from Chicago to New York in 1865 was $3.45 to ship. Fast forward 30 years later, it's 68 cents a barrel to ship. That is a huge efficiency accomplishment by just adding brakes to the trains. And who would have thought that brakes would be something that no one would think of, or at least be able to figure out. Now, communication is going to grow during this time as well. The telephone is developed by Alexander Bell. 1878, the telephone is in the White House. And by 1900, 1.5 million phones are in use in America. Now, it's still not a huge number, but it does show you that in a 30-year period, the phone is already developing and expanding. And obviously, by the mid to late 1900s, the telephone's huge. We also had the power to build things that we hadn't had before, and a lot of that's going to come from our next thing, talking about Carnegie. But the Brooklyn Bridge opens in 1883, connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan, and it was just a symbol of American ingenuity. And the power to build things is that symbol, is that we started expanding. It's just this idea that Americans are able to build and expand, and that we have this just ingrained ingenuity in us. Now, from that, we're going to move on to John D. Rockefeller, who started the Standard Oil Company. We're going to kind of get into some of our huge industrialist during this time. And John D. Rockefeller was able to develop a monopoly over the oil industry. And basically what that means is he tried to take and consolidate the entire oil industry into one company. And he did this through holding companies in trust. And essentially a trust is normally a contract between two parties that eventually benefits a third party. So you have a trustee, you have a grantor, and then you have a beneficiary. The trustee puts his things into a trust with the grantor. The grantor then is going to, or the grantor, puts those things in a trustee, a trust. The trustee is going to put those things into the hands of the beneficiaries, and he's going to kind of divvy those things out over time. The problem is that the way that Rockefeller set up his trust was that he joined all of these companies together into a trust in which he was the trustee running the trust, but he was also the beneficiary of the profits. So it's not profiting the owner or other people that are involved in all these companies. It's benefiting him by joining them all together and benefiting him by getting all of the benefits from the trust. But essentially, it's not real complicated. It's just a central corporate body that buys up stock of Standard Oil Trust and takes direct control. Okay, so they're controlling all of the oil industry, and as a result of this, Rockefeller's making a ton of money, but also creating a very, very dangerous standard that one person and one company owns an entire industry. Now, another one of these large industrialists is Andrew Carnegie. He started at very humble beginnings in a cotton factory, making $1.20 a week, and there you go with child labor, which we're going to talk about in tomorrow's or day 4 notes and day 5. He eventually became the secretary to the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but when his boss leaves during the Civil War, Carnegie takes over. So he very early on had a huge hand in developing a railroad, developing a business, and so he really started to look into how he could advance not only from a industrial side, but also as a man and making more money, etc. And one of the ways that he saw was investing heavily in Henry Bessemer's process of making steel. And what Henry Bessemer and a few others had figured out is that there was various things they could do to the steel which would not only cut the price of making it, but also would make it very, very quickly in comparison to what it had been made years before. And it was a lot stronger. Carnegie, because he was so heavily invested in this process, and because he could make it so cheaply and efficiently, he was able to basically drive out the entire industry and own every single company that made steel in America. And that's very, very impressive. One other note about Andrew Carnegie, as a result of some various things, and you can look it up, just had to do with him being connected to a disaster, or a natural disaster. It wasn't really a natural, it was created by Henry Frick. But anyways, you'll learn more about Frick in our day 4 notes. Carnegie becomes a philanthropist. He donated millions of dollars to public libraries, artistic and research institutions, and just distributed money to the communities. He was a very, very philanthropic man. Now, this brings us to a few of our last things. Some of the beliefs from some of these industrialists were things such as social Darwinism, and they believed that society shouldn't interfere with the success or failure of people. That basically they should have a laissez-faire or hands-off approach, that they should not get involved in trying to determine whether the economy or whether people in the economy are successful or fail, that the economy will be successful if they take their hands off, because it'll allow basically the cream to rise to the top. And Carnegie kind of continues this with his belief in the gospel of wealth. And all that said was that people should be free to make as much money as possible. And the reason he believed this, obviously, is because he's very, very rich and very successful, but also because he believed that you should allow people to grow and make their money because that's their right. Now, we're going to talk about vertical integration, horizontal integration. Okay, vertical integration is going to combine all parts of an industry into one company. All right, and if you notice here on the left, this is like an entire process of a meat packing industry. Okay, so it starts with the cattle, somebody raises the cattle, somebody opens the slaughterhouse, somebody refrigerates the rail cars. In vertical integration, you integrate all this into one place and it becomes one company. In horizontal integration, you're integrating all the parts that are the same types of company. So all of these are oil refineries, and so is this. Instead of there being 4 oil refineries, they consolidate into one refinery. Now, there may be another part that sells the oil, that does, getting it out of the ground, etc. But the actual refineries, that one part, all the businesses are joining into one. Now, the last few things we're going to talk about are just some terms. First of all is a monopoly, which is where one business owns an entire industry. That's what's going to happen with Rockefeller. And I put an example here that Apple can make phones, and then basically Samsung or LG or whoever it is couldn't make a phone. Only Apple could. That would be a monopoly. Also, cartels were very popular during this time, in which groups of companies that were not together would basically join together and raise their prices. And that's kind of what Rockefeller and some of these other men are going to do. So that's the end of the notes today. Sorry I ran a little long. I want to tell you a few of those stories. Here's your vocabulary, and please let me know if you have any questions going forward.